Gilles Deleuze on Palestine, 4 essays. Spoilers of Peace, 1978. How could the Palestinians be, quote, genuine partners in peace talks when they have no country? But how could they have a country when it was taken from them? The Palestinians were never given any choice other than unconditional surrender. All they were offered was death. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the actions of the Israelis are considered legitimate retaliation, even if their attacks do seem disproportionate. Whereas the actions of the Palestinians are without fail treated as terrorist crimes. And the death of a Palestinian has neither the same interest nor the same impact as the death of an Israeli. Since 1969, Israel has unrelentingly bombed and strafed southern Lebanon. Israel has explicitly said that its recent invasion of Lebanon was not in retaliation for the terrorist attack on Tel Aviv, 11 terrorists against 30,000 soldiers. This is an allusion to the major offensive begun a few weeks earlier by the Begin government in southern Lebanon, in retaliation for a Palestinian commando raid to the north of Tel Aviv, which claimed several dozen lives. For the State of Israel, this offensive was the biggest ever in Lebanese territory, claiming hundreds of lives in the Palestinian camps and the Lebanese population, and provoking the exodus of tens of thousands of Lebanese civilians to the capital. Despite its size, the Israeli offensive did not succeed in destroying the Palestinian military bases. The front remained open. One in a whole series of operations to be initiated at Israel's discretion. For a, quote, final solution to the Palestinian question, Israel can count on the almost unanimous complicity of other states, with various nuances and restrictions. A people without land, and without a state, the Palestinians are the spoilers of peace for everyone involved. If they have received economic and military aid from certain countries, it has been in vain. The Palestinians know what they are talking about when they say they are alone. Palestinian militants are also saying that they have managed to pull off a kind of victory. Left behind in southern Lebanon were only resistance groups, which seem to have held up quite well under attack. The Israeli invasion, on the other hand, struck blindly at Palestinian refugees and Lebanese farmers, a poor population that lives off the land. Destruction of villages and cities, and the massacre of innocent civilians have been confirmed. Several sources indicate that cluster bombs were used. This population of southern Lebanon, in perpetual exile, keeps leaving and coming back under Israeli military strikes, that one is hard-pressed to distinguish from acts of terrorism. The latest hostilities have ousted more than 200,000 from their homes, now refugees wandering the roads. The State of Israel is using in southern Lebanon the method which proved so effective in Galilee and elsewhere in 1948. It is Palestinizing southern Lebanon. Palestinian militants for the most part come from this population of refugees. Israel thinks it will defeat the militants by creating more refugees, thereby surely creating more militants. It is not merely because we have a relationship with Lebanon that we say Israel is massacring a fragile and complex country. There is something else. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a model that will determine how problems of terrorism will be dealt with elsewhere, even in Europe. The worldwide cooperation of states, and the worldwide organization of police and criminal proceedings will necessarily lead to a classification extending to more and more people who will be considered virtual quote-unquote terrorists. This situation is analogous to the Spanish Civil War, when Spain served as an experimental laboratory for a far more terrible future. Today, Israel is conducting an experiment. It has invented a model of repression that, once adapted, will profit other countries. There is great continuity in Israeli politics. Israel believes that the UN resolutions verbally condemning Israel, in fact, put it in the right. Israel has transformed the invitation to leave the occupied territories into the right to establish colonies there. It thinks sending an international peacekeeping force into southern Lebanon is an excellent idea, provided that this force, in the place of Israeli forces, transform the region into a police zone, a desert of security. This conflict is a curious kind of blackmail, from which the whole world will never escape unless we lobby for the Palestinians to be recognized for what they are, quote-unquote genuine partners, in peace talks. They are indeed at war, and a war they did not choose. The Indians of Palestine, 1982, an interview between Gilles Deleuze and Elias Sanbar. Deleuze. It seems like something has come of age in the Palestinian camp. A new tone is apparent, as though they had overcome the first stage of their crises, as though they had reached a place of certainty or serenity, with a new sense of their rights. This would seem to indicate a new consciousness. The new tone seems to enable them to speak in a new way, neither aggressively nor defensively, but as quote-unquote equals with the world. How do you explain this, since the Palestinians have yet to achieve their political objectives? Elias Sanbar. We had a sense of this right after the publication of our first issue. Many concerned with the struggle said, quote, "Hey, now the Palestinians have their own journal," unquote. And it seems to have shaken off a long-standing image of Palestinians in the eyes of the world. Let's not forget that, in the eyes of many, the image of the Palestinian combatant, the one which we are trying to promote, had remained very abstract. In other words, before we imposed the reality of our presence, we were thought of only as refugees. When our resistance movement made clear that our struggle could not be ignored, we were again reduced to a cliched image. We were seen as pure and simple militarists. This image was isolated and reproduced ad infinitum. We were perceived as standing for nothing else. It is to rid ourselves of the militarist image in the strict sense that we prefer this other image of the combatant. I believe the surprise which our journal has elicited also comes from the fact that many people must be telling themselves that Palestinians actually exist, and not merely for the sake of calling abstract principles to mind. Although the journal is Palestinian, it nonetheless constitutes a terrain where many different preoccupations can be expressed, a place where not only Palestinian voices can be heard, but also Arab, Jewish, and European voices. Some people might also be realizing that this kind of work, coming as it does from various horizons, points to the existence of many different Palestinians in the various sectors of Palestinian society: painters, sculptors, workers, farmers, novelists, bankers, actors, businessmen, professors, etc. In short, they realize that a whole society exists behind this journal. Palestine is not only a people, but a land. Palestine is what links this people to a land which has been pillaged and plundered. It is a place where exile and an immense desire to return are at work. A unique place, made up of all the expulsions which our people have suffered since 1948. When we study Palestine, scrutinize it, follow its least movements, and keep track of the changes that affect it, we have an image of Palestine in our eyes, and we never lose that from sight. Deleuze. Many of the articles in your journal refer to, and analyze in a new way, the methods that have been used to chase Palestinians from their territory. This is crucial because Palestinians do not find themselves in a typical colonial situation. They are not so much colonized as they are cleared away, chased off. In your book, you compare the Palestinians to American Indians. There are indeed two distinct movements in capitalism. In the first, a people is maintained on its land and made to work, exploited to accumulate a surplus. This is what we usually mean by colony. But in the second, a territory is emptied of its people. Capitalism thus makes a giant leap in a single bound, even if that means importing workers and manual labor. The history of Zionism, the history of Israel, and the history of the United States have all gone that route. How does one create a vacuum? How does one empty out a territory? Yasser Arafat in an interview has pointed out the limits of the comparison, and this limit comprises the horizon of your journal. He says the difference is the Arab world, whereas the American Indians, having been expulsed from their territory, had no one to whom they could turn for economic or military support. Sanbar. As exiles, we are rather particular, because we were expulsed not to some foreign country, but to the outer reaches of our homeland. We were exiled to Arab countries where it never crossed anyone's mind to disband us. I am thinking of the hypocrisy of some Israelis who assert that the Arabs are at fault for not quote-unquote integrating us, which in Israeli speak means quote making us disappear. Those who expulsed us are suddenly concerned about some supposed Arab racism against us. Does that mean we did not encounter difficult situations in certain Arab countries? Of course not. We certainly did. But these difficulties did not come from our being Arab. They were unavoidable because we were, and still are, an armed revolution. But to our Jewish colonizers, we are indeed the Indians of Palestine. All we were to do was disappear from view. In this sense, the history of the establishment of Israel is a repeat of the process that gave birth to the United States of America. Therein probably lies one of the essential ingredients in their mutual solidarity. In this, moreover, you see elements that illustrate how during the period of the British Trust, e.g. Palestine was under a British military regime until 1921, when the League of Nations declared it a trust territory of Great Britain. The civil administration began in 1923 and lasted until May 15, 1948, when the British departed and the State of Israel was declared. We were not subjected to a quote-unquote classic colonization, where colonizers and colonized live side by side. The French, the English, etc., wanted to establish areas whose very condition of existence depended on the presence of indigenous people. For any domination to take effect, there had to be a people to be dominated. This created, perhaps unintentionally, common areas, that is, networks or sectors or aspects of social life where the quote-unquote encounter between colonizer and colonized took place. That this encounter was unbearable, exploitable, crushing, or oppressive does not change the fact that the foreign colonizer had first to be in contact with the locals in order to exert his domination. Then Zionism comes along, but its assumptions are the opposite. Our absence is a necessity, and what is more, as Ilan Halevi has shown, cornerstone of our rejection, our displacement, our quote-unquote transfer, and substitution is a specific feature of Zionists, namely, their belonging to the Jewish community. In this way, a whole new breed of colonizer was born, an unknown, arriving amidst the mass of what I just called foreign colonizers. This new colonizer proceeds by making of his own characteristics the basis for the total rejection of the other. Furthermore, in some ways our country was not just colonized in 1948, it disappeared. In any event, that is how the Jewish colonizers, who have become Israelis, must have experienced it. The Zionist movement mobilized the Jewish community in Palestine, not with the idea that the Palestinians would one day leave, but with the idea that the country was empty. There were other Jews, of course, who, having arrived, saw how untrue it was and wrote about it, but the majority of the Jewish community acted like the people with whom they came face to face every day, living and working, were not there. This blindness, however, was not physical. No one was fooled to that degree, but everyone understood that the people living in their midst were, quote, in the process of disappearing, unquote. And they realized that if this disappearance was going to succeed, from the outset they had to act as though it had already happened, by never seeing the existence of the other, who was nonetheless unmistakably present. Emptying the territory, if it were to succeed, had to begin by emptying the other, from the head of the colonizer. One of the ways Zionism succeeded was by playing the race card, making Judaism the very basis for the expulsion, the rejection of the other. The racist persecutions in Europe were extremely helpful in this respect, since they provided Zionism with a confirmation of the steps it had to take. We believe that Zionism has imprisoned Jews, holding them captive to the vision I just described. I want to emphasize that it still holds them captive. It is not true merely of one particular historical moment. I say this because Zionism's rationale changed after the Holocaust. Zionism mutated, positing a pseudo-eternal principle that Jews everywhere were from time immemorial the other in whatever society they lived. However, no people, no community can claim to occupy this position of the marginalized, the cursed other, in a way that is permanent and inalterable. And luckily this is true, especially for the Jews. Today in the Middle East, the other is the Arab and the Palestinian. The disappearance of this other is now the order of the day, and the fact that it is from this other, who is in danger of disappearing, that the Western powers ask for assurances, is the height of hypocrisy and cynicism. We are the ones who need assurances, if we are to be protected from the madness of the Israeli military leaders. In any event, the PLO, our unique and only representative, has proposed a solution to the conflict, a democratic state in Palestine, a state where the walls that exist between inhabitants, whoever they are, would be demolished. Deleuze. The opening pages of the first issue of your journal contain a manifesto. We are, quote, a people like any other people. The sense of this declaration is multiple. In the first place, it is a reminder or a cry. The Palestinians are constantly reproached with refusing to recognize Israel. Look, say the Israelis, they want to destroy us. But for more than 50 years now, the Palestinians have been struggling for recognition as a people. In the second place, the declaration marks an opposition with the Manifesto of Israel, which says, quote, we are not a people like any other people, unquote, because of our transcendence and the enormity of our persecutions. Hence, in the second issue, the importance of two texts by Israeli writers on the Holocaust, and the significance which this event has assumed in Israel, especially with respect to the Palestinians in the Arab world, untouched by such a catastrophe. By demanding, quote, to be treated as a people with an exceptional status, unquote, the state of Israel maintains an economic and financial dependence on the West in a way that no other state ever has. This dependence on the West explains why the Palestinians are so adamant about the contrary declaration. They want to become what they are, that is, a people with an unexceptional status. As opposed to history as apocalypse, there is a sense of history as possibility, the multiplicity of what is possible, the profusion of multiple possibilities at every moment. Is this not what your journal hopes to make apparent in its analyses? Sanbar. Absolutely. The idea of a cry to remind the world of our existence is deeply meaningful, but it is also quite simple. It is the kind of truth which, once it has been recognized, will make things very difficult for anyone still counting on the disappearance of the Palestinian people. In the end, what this truth says is that every people has a right to its rights, so to speak. This is self-evident, but so powerful that it represents the point of departure and the destination of every political struggle. Look at the Zionists. What do they have to say on this subject? You will never hear them say the Palestinian people have a right to nothing. No amount of force can maintain such a position, and they know it. But you will hear them say there is no Palestinian people. This is why the affirmation of the existence of the Palestinian people is so very powerful, much more so than it might at first appear. The importance of being Arafat, 1983. The Palestinian cause is above all the sum total of the injustices that the Palestinian people has endured and continues to endure. These injustices include acts of violence, but also the illogicality born of injustice and false reasoning, and the false promises to compensate or justify those acts. Arafat had only one word for the broken promises and the forsaken commitments of the Sabra and Shatila massacres: shame, shame. Some say it is not genocide, and yet from its very beginning, this history bears a great resemblance to Orador. Orador-sur-Glane is a town near Limoges, where on June 10, 1944, soldiers of the German Waffen SS killed 642 villagers, almost all of its inhabitants. The ruins of the town are still preserved today. Zionist terrorism was not only directed against the British, but against the Arab villages that had to be erased. The Irgun was very active in this regard. The Irgun was an armed branch of the extremist movement founded by Vladimir Jabotinsky, also the founder of the Likud. The Irgun, directed at the time by Menachem Begin, led actions against both the Arab-Palestinian national movement and the British administration. It was notably responsible for the massacre of a Palestinian village on the outskirts of Jerusalem in 1948 and the attack on the King David Hotel, which at the time was the seat of the British Mandate in Jerusalem. From the start, they acted not only as if the Palestinian people should no longer exist, but as if it never had existed. The conquerors had just suffered the worst genocide in history. The Zionists turned this genocide into an absolute evil. But turning the worst genocide in history into an absolute evil is a religious and mystic approach, not an historical one. It does not stop the evil. On the contrary, it propagates it, inflicting it on other innocents. It demands reparations that cause others to suffer some part of what the Jews suffered: exile, ghettoization, disappearance as a people. With colder means than genocide, they want to achieve the same ends. The United States and Europe owed reparations to the Jews, and they made a people pay for these reparations who, to say the least, had nothing to do with the Holocaust, had never even heard of it, and therefore was totally innocent. It was a grotesque and violent beginning. Zionism and the State of Israel demanded that the Palestinians recognize their rights, yet the Israeli state had continued to deny even the fact of a Palestinian people. It does not speak of Palestinians, but of Palestinian Arabs, as if they were living there by chance or by mistake. Later, Israelis acted as if the evicted Palestinians came from abroad. They always failed to mention the first war of resistance the Palestinians waged on their own. The Palestinians were labeled heirs to Hitler because they did not recognize Israel's rights. Then a fiction began that spread wider and wider, weighing on all of those who defended the Palestinian cause. This fiction, Israel's wager, was to call anyone who protested the de facto conditions and the actions of the Zionist state an anti-Semite. The origin of this operation lay in Israel's coldly political approach to the Palestinians. Israel never once hit its aims, to empty the Palestinian territory. They pretended as if the land was already empty, since it had always been destined for the Zionist. It was colonization, but not the 19th century kind. Instead of exploiting the country's inhabitants, they would be forced out. Those who remained would not become a workforce dependent on the land, but a temporary, detached workforce, like immigrants in a ghetto. From the beginning, the purchase of land was made with the understanding that it was empty of all inhabitants, or could be emptied. It is genocide, but genocide where physical extermination is subordinated to geographical evacuation. Being merely generic Arabs, the surviving Palestinians would disappear in the mass of Arabs. Physical extermination, be it entrusted to mercenaries or not, is perfectly present. But they say it is not genocide, since genocide is not their final goal. Indeed, it is only one of the means. The complicity of the United States with Israel does not come solely from a powerful Zionist lobby in the US. Elias Sanbar has shown how the United States discovered a parallel with its own history in Israel, the extermination of the Indians, which was also only in part directly physical. They also had to empty the land, as if there had never been any Indians except in the reservations, ghettos, that turned them into immigrants from within. In many ways, the Palestinians are the new Indians, the Indians of Israel. Marxist analyses indicate two complementary movements in capitalism, constantly imposing limits for itself, within which it sets up and exploits its own system, and pushing back these limits, going beyond them to start its foundation again, on a larger or more intensive scale. Pushing back limits is the act of American capitalism, of the American dream. Israel has acted in kind with its dream of a greater Israel on Arab lands, a dream built on the backs of Arabs. The Palestinian people found the strength to resist, and they resisted. They became an armed nation from a people of common lineage. Landless and stateless, they have managed to form an organization that not only represents but incarnates the people. A great historical figure was needed, almost a Shakespearean figure, to speak in Western terms. This figure is Arafat. It is not the first time this has happened in history. A reference for the French would be La France Libre, although it benefited from the less popular support at first. Also, not without historical precedent. The Israelis have deliberately, knowingly destroyed every opportunity for a solution. Every chance for a possible solution. They remain entrenched in their religious position, denying not only the rights but the very fact of Palestinians. They wash their hands of their own territory by treating the Palestinians as foreign terrorists. And precisely because the Palestinians were not from abroad, but a specific people as different from other Arabs as Europeans are different from each other, they only received ambiguous aid from Arab states. This aid sometimes changed to hostility and extermination when the Palestinian movement became too dangerous for them. The Palestinians have suffered all the hellish cycles of history. The consistent failure of all proposed solutions, alliances turning against them in the worst reversals, and the most solemn promises broken. Their resistance was forced to grow from all of those setbacks. One of the goals of the Sabra and Shatila massacres may have been to discredit Arafat. He only agreed to the departure of combatants, whose forces had remained intact, on the condition that the United States and Israel ensure the safety of their families. After the massacres, he could only say, shame. If the crisis that followed for the PLO resulted sooner or later in its integration into an Arab state or its dissolution in Islamic fundamentalism, then the Palestinian people would truly disappear. But then the situation would be such that the United States and Israel would regret all the lost chances, including those that are still possible today. Responding to Israel's boastful statement, quote, "We are not a people like any other," unquote, the Palestinians have repeated their own cry, the one evoked in the first issue of the Revue d'études Palestiniens. We are a people like any other. That is all we want to be. By waging a terrorist war in Lebanon, Israel thought it could eliminate the PLO and knock down the pillar of a Palestinian people that had already lost its land. It may have succeeded, since with Tripoli surrounded, there remains only Arafat's physical presence amongst his own, all of them bearing a kind of solitary grandeur. But the Palestinian people will not lose its identity without giving rise to a double terrorism, a state and religious terrorism that will take advantage of its disappearance and make any chance of a peaceful settlement with Israel impossible. The war in Lebanon will leave Israel not only morally torn and in economic disarray, but the country will also have to confront the reverse image of its own intolerance. A political solution, a peaceful settlement, is only possible with an independent PLO, one that has not been swallowed by an existing state or been absorbed by any number of fundamentalist movements. The disappearance of the PLO would only mean the victory of the blind forces of war that care nothing for Palestinian survival. Stones, 1988. Europe owes its Jews an infinite debt that Europe has not even begun to pay. Instead, an innocent people is being made to pay, the Palestinians. The Zionists have constructed the state of Israel out of the recent past of their genocide, that unforgettable European horror, but also out of the suffering of this other people, using the stones of this other people. Irgun was labeled a terrorist organization not only because they bombed English neighborhoods, but also because they destroyed villages, killing innocent people. The Americans have made a multi-billion-dollar Western out of the whole affair. We are to believe that the state of Israel has been established in an empty land, which has been awaiting the return of the ancient Hebrews for centuries. The ghosts of a few Arabs that are around, keeping watch over the sleepy stones, came from somewhere else. The Palestinians, tossed aside, forgotten, have been called on to recognize the right of Israel to exist, while the Israelis have continued to deny the fact of the existence of a Palestinian people. From the beginning, the Palestinian people have carried out, on their own, a war which continues to this day in defense of their land, their stones, their way of life. No one mentions this first war, since it is so crucial to have people believe that the Palestinians are Arabs from somewhere else, and who can go back? Who will disentangle all these Jordans? Who will speak up and say that the ties between a Palestinian and another Arab may be strong, but no stronger than those between two nations of Europe? And what Palestinian can forget what they have suffered at the hands of their Arab neighbors, not to mention those of the Israelis? What is the crux of this new debt? The Palestinians chased from their land have settled where they can, at least keep this land in sight, preserving their vision of it as the last contact with their hallucinatory being. The Israelis never could chase them away, never completely erase them, cover them in the oblivion of night. The destruction of villages, houses dynamited, expulsions, assassinations, a history of horrors has started anew, once again on the backs of the innocent. They say the Israeli Secret Service is the envy of the world. But what sort of a democracy is it whose politics are indistinguishable from the actions of its own Secret Service? Quote, "They're all named Abu," unquote, declares an Israeli official after the assassination of Abu Jihad. Does he recall the hideous sound of those voices that said, quote, "They're all named Levi"? How will Israel succeed with its annexed lands, its occupied territories, with its settlers and its settlements, with its lunatic rabbis? Through occupation, infinite occupation. The stones raining down on them come from within. They come from the Palestinian people to remind us that there is a place in the world, no matter how confined, where the debt has been reversed. The stones thrown from the hands of the Palestinians are their stones, the living stones of their country. A debt cannot be paid with 1, 2, 3, 7, 10 murders a day, and it cannot be paid with third-party agreements. The third party is ultimately nowhere to be found. Every death calls out to the living, and the Palestinians have become part of the soul of Israel. The Palestinians sound the depth of that soul, and torment it with their piercing stones.